Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody. The Jean Nicod lectures, started in 1993, have run yearly without interruption until the pandemics. We are now at the 26th edition, corresponding to a 2020 lectures. As sometimes we honor two laureates at a time, we have this year the 29th and 30th Jean Nicod laureate, Leda Cosmides and John Tooby of the University of Santa Barbara in California. And as we resume some kind of normalcy in 2021, we will have also another edition of the prize in November with Francis Egan of Rutgers University. So 2021 will be the year with 3 laureates. As the director of the Jean Nicod Institute, I'm the de jure honorary president of the prize, but the real work is done by the prize secretary, Frédéric de Vignemont, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. On her behalf, I now give the floor to Dan Sperber, who will introduce our laureates. Thank you, Dan.
Merci. So it's indeed my great pleasure to introduce the Jean Nicod lecturer, Leda Cosmides and John Tooby. Just a few words about the background and how come they are here with us. So they both got their PhD at Harvard in the 80s. Leda got a PhD in cognitive psychology. You did, John, in biology. No, in anthropology, sorry. In anthropology, but you had a biological background, and beyond that, even physics. I've been over this. Yeah, so a very scientific mind, which you demonstrate ever since. And in 87, they published not their first joint paper. The first one had been on a biological topic, but the second joint paper, which really introduced evolutionary psychology, the way they defended it. And the title is, it was published in a book edited by a philosopher of science, John Dupré. The title of the book was The Latest and On the Best, Essays on Evolutional Optimality. And the title of the paper by John and Leda was From Evolution to Behavior, Evolutionary Psychology as the Missing Link. And in that title, there's a clear indication of how radical the take was on how the uses of evolutionary thinking should be made in the study of human behavior, culture, and so on. Missing link, why? Because in those days, you may remember, for those who are old enough, or you may have heard about it if you read storybooks, sociobiology in its earlier form was fairly dominant, and a general approach from people looking at society, animal and human society in a biological perspective was to assume that you could somehow explain behavior, in particular social behavior, directly on the basis of genes. And they made the point, which in a way should be trivial, but working it out in detail, there's nothing trivial about it, is that of course there's a missing link between gene and behavior, namely the mind, namely psychological mechanism. And this opened in evolutionary approaches to, in particular, human affairs, a whole range of issues and problems to the study of which we made such major contribution that the field was really changed thanks to their work. In 89, Leda published a paper, again, with an interesting title, The Logic of Social Exchange, Has Natural Selection Shaped How Humans Reason? An interesting, what's really symptomatic about this title is that evolutionary approach to psychology had focused on those aspects where the relationship to fitness is the most obvious, sexuality, mating, and so on. Again, for a sensible reason. But of course, the relevance of an evolutionary perspective to the study of humans depends on its extending to the whole range of psychological mechanisms. And you know, if you ask indeed about as she did in the title, as natural selection shaped our human reason. That is really a big, exciting challenge. I had the privilege of being one of the reviewers of this article, and many of you, I guess, in the room have already not just had papers reviewed, but done reviewing. It's not always very gratifying to do that. This was the most stimulating paper I ever had to review. It was very rich. I had agreements, disagreements, but I was so stimulated, and I insisted that it should be indeed published, and that all the issues it raised should be debated publicly and not in the reviewing process. In '92, they co-edited a book called The Adapted Mind, Evolutionary Psychology and the Generation of Culture. And now you see that extends, it's not just psychology of the individual, but the social and cultural aspect is present in the perspective. Well, it's an edited volume, but they have 200 pages in it. That is, their contributions, 2 chapters to this book are book length. And they were kind of developed a précis manifesto for where evolutionary psychology, how it might develop. They had been recruited the year before, both in Santa Barbara, leader in psychology, and you, John, in anthropology, where they founded a center for evolutionary psychology, where they trained many great younger researchers, which many of whom occupy important positions in the field in the States, and where they've been doing work on, again, a wide range of topics: cooperation, coalition psychology, judgment and uncertainty, visual attention, kid detection, memory, emotions, and so it's a very rich exploitation of this evolutionary perspective in the study of a great variety of psychological phenomena. And their work has had a major influence on a variety of issues. First, directly on psychology. So if you look at the mentions of an evolutionary perspective in psychology before the 80s, first, they are rare. Second, they're typically extremely superficial. They're not really helpful. What progressively happens from then on, and very much under their influence, is that all, to begin with, very much in developmental psychology, but also the other domains of psychology, serious discussion of an evolutionary perspective of the possibility that some mechanisms have been shaped by evolution and selective pressures, play a more and more important role. So it's not that everybody's been converted to evolutionary psychology, and in a way that's not the goal. The goal is to propose a framework in which to think psychological problems in general, and there's still plenty of progress to be made in that line, but really the field has been changed under the influence, including among a number of psychologists who are not in agreement with Lydia and John, who take a different view on the role of evolution, but who are at least now are addressing the issue, and in many cases do that seriously. Influence on the social science, the study of culture. A number of people actually here at École normale supérieure, Institut Jean Nicod, are working on social and cultural phenomena in a way that is strongly influenced by the evolutionary psychology as proposed by John and Lida. And philosophy. I mean, the Jean Nicod lectures are lectures in philosophy. As I mentioned, the first paper was published in a philosophical volume. And a number of philosophers have really been strongly influenced by Lida's and John's work. Steve Stitch, for instance, Peter Carruthers, a French philosopher who's made his career in the United States, Edouard Machery. Just to give an example of the richness of issues that are raised. So here's the title again, and I can't discuss papers, of a title of a paper by Steve Stitch and Ron Mellon, The Odd Couple, the Compatibility of Social Construction and Evolutionary Psychology. So it's a nice title, because you might say, biological approach, and so on, evolution, that's going to be reductionist, totally against any kind of contribution that you may get from the standard social science. Well, no, the issue is much richer and more complex, as this title suggests. Of course, there have been a lot of critics, again, among philosophers, Jerry Fodor famously, Kim Sterranley, a former Jean Nicod lecturer, has strong reservations about your program. John Dupré was the editor of this volume, has become more of a critic of evolutionary psychology, and a number of others. But these are extremely interesting discussions. What's not so interesting is there have been a lot of polemics also. Polemics from various quarters, some, including some philosophers, who really caricature the program or attack it on ideological ground without looking at the substance. And John and Lila have spent a lot of time actually answering, painstakingly and with very careful argument with various polemics. But I think the paying attention to a scientific substance of what they propose is very much in the spirit of the Nicod lectures, where we're trying to put together a philosophical and a cognitive perspective. So I'm done. And who should I give?
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. So I now give the floor to John Tooby, who will lecture on natural selection, replicators, and the downstream worlds of mind and society. Thank you, John. Welcome.
So, mic working? Okay. Thank you, Dan, and thank you. And Dan has had a huge impact on our thinking over the years, and it's and not to mention, we might be fast food workers at McDonald's if it weren't for his role in crucial points. But anyway. So notice the self-aggrandizing title here. And then the thing I want to talk about today, emphasize, is a question that while people answer it, pay attention to it some, we don't pay attention to it nearly as much as we ought to, which is, where does the order that we find in physical systems, in biological systems, in human life and human culture come from? And I'm going to argue that the ultimate origin of it is natural selection or replicator dynamics. And okay. And one thing about a talk like this is that every time I write out in linear form how to cover a complex structure, I realize I should have started someplace else. And so on the way over here, I realized there's something I should say before anything else. Start a different place than I was going to, which is to say, everybody is familiar with Alan Turing and Turing machines and Claude Shannon and information theory. And I want to sort of put somebody else up there, which is, people know about, but not, I think is not how people have approach computationalism, is through a Turing general purpose device. And that I want to say there was a very culturally important reason for that, because Turing was trying to solve a problem of decrypting. And the evolutionary antagonist was an entity which is trying to remove any possible predictability out of the signal. Okay. And so by the very nature of the problem, the kind of computational device he envisioned was the most general possible kind of computational approach. And so, and that's was technologically extremely useful. And so that's just been the sun or the black hole or whatever, the huge gravitational force around which our thinking about computationalism originated and has continued. And also, there's another kind of cultural reason, that if you want to make it's how much better is it to make a tool that you can take with you everywhere and do many, many things with it, as opposed to work really hard on a tool and it can solve this one problem, but not this other problem over here. So there's this, our intellectual effort is drawn towards general problem-solving approaches and away from the fact that lots of problems in life can be solved very simply and elegantly if you target and you don't get too ambitious about what it is, you just have a narrow scope on a particular family of problems. And then you might find very elegant, very, I don't want to say too simple, but elegant and not too complicated ways in which problems can be solved, right? And that so that the other person is Norbert Wiener or Wiener. I don't know how he pronounced it, but we Americans pronounce it Wiener anyway, or Wiener. Anyway, that he started to work at the same time as Turing. In fact, he'd done earlier work on probability theory, which turned out to be highly applicable to what he came to call cybernetics, right? And that has a sort of old-fashioned flavor to us now because of the dominance of this sort of Turing paradigm. But that, what he was trying to solve, he wanted to put himself in the service of the war effort. And he found himself ending up working on aircraft fire control systems, right? So here you have a problem. You're just trying to shoot down aircraft, and you can't really hit them because they're too small and fast moving, but you can, the closer you can get so the shrapnel explodes to the general vicinity. So you have to have the thing timed to go off at the right altitude. The planes are moving targets, and so you can't shoot to where it is. You have to anticipate where it's going to be, and that and also what will happen to your projectile on the way, sort of the winds on the way up and the air density and the winds where the plane is, and there's all sorts of different parameters in a fire control system. And also there's the delay, right? So you have to take into account how long the transit will be. So there's all these different factors. And he realized that prior to this, you sort of, fire control system, you figure out sort of what you're aiming at. And then it was conceived as that the machinery which then turned the thing was just machinery, right? And he realized that this was communication, that the delays in the properties, physical properties of the rest of the system all require a certain kind of communication and feedback, develop the idea of feedback, right? And so here you have so there's a whole cybernetic approach to information processing. And in the cybernetic approach to information processing, you're not a machine contemplating the universe and not doing anything. You are, in fact, in the middle of a system which is designed to have effects on the world. And so the task environment matters. What does the world look like? That matters. And then what does your body, what you're controlling look like? And then there is a definition of success, which is accomplishing something in the actual world, right? And so all these kinds of, so this, he developed a series of ways of thinking about, so he coined the term cybernetics. Actually, Ampere coined the word cybernetics, but he meant government by it. But anyway, so Wiener coined the term from the Greek for steersman, right? Because he thought of things as a regulatory system, right? Okay, so computation as a specialized set of arrangements in the service of a function with a definition of success in a task environment with the entity. For our case, for humans, it would be the organism. But anyway, the artillery and the engines for changing the trajectory and so on, the radar system and so on. Or you could do the same kind of analysis on a drone. And the point. So the next point is a very. It's both trivially obvious and yet I don't think we've really ever civilizationally come to terms with it, which is that leaping ahead, we are cybernetic systems came into the universe inside replicating organisms to better regulate their set of transactions with the world, so they had higher fitness, they replicated better, right? And so that's where, you know, to get my PhD, I had to translate a significant chunk of Teilhard de Chardin because the people testing me were very sadistic. But he had all these things about the transition from Neanderthal to Homo sapiens was the most metaphysically significant thing since the change from the mineral kingdom to the living kingdom, right? Anyway, and it was full of French tenses, which I still don't understand, but pluperfect, subjunctive, historic. Anyway, but the point here is that everything that we think, everything that we feel, the whole universe, which seems to be outside of us, out there, all of our representation of that as real are in fact information states inside an evolved cybernetic system, right? And that's where information and meaning come into existence in the universe, right? And it comes into, and so there's that, and then we make devices and so on, so there's downstream effects of our high levels of organization and cybernetic meaning. But it's not Turing machine computationalism, it's cybernetic computationalism that is what we should be thinking about, right? And even though that seems far-fetched, because the more complicated things you're going to be doing, the more you might pool different sorts of information together in different kinds of cognitive subsystems. And so it will seem like we can think about anything, and we are seeing the world, and there's no internal. But that's not true. There's all, you know, neuroscience and so on has discovered all sorts of different subsidiary, quasi-autonomous systems for representing and muscular control and you know, spatial and visual processing and so on. And so those are all different subunits of a cybernetic system, and they interact in a way that sort of weaves together subjectively. We feel we have a coherent experience of the universe, but it's not this single computer with transparent knowledge everywhere. There's lots of independent devices, and they don't communicate with each other. They are designed to communicate with each other only insofar as they customarily would have needed to. So it's easy to demonstrate that you can communicate stuff to one part of our cognitive architecture without its ramifications being traced out by the other systems. Okay, so this was all a preface. Okay, power control system, and now I'm going to start, right? So thank you for coming. Lita and I really appreciate this, and we're, you know, delighted, honored, and touched by this whole process. And the most gratifying part of all this is being rewarded with your attention, right? Because it's the kind of people I like to talk to, we like to talk to. And then I really have to say that I'm so grateful that so many academics in the world have been gracious enough to learn English, because I am a total failure at other languages, especially French. And I'm only here today because after inflicting anguish beyond measure on my French teacher, Madame Guéry, we struck a corrupt bargain that she would pass me on the written work, provided she didn't ever, ever, ever have to hear me say attempt any French out loud. And she would say, you know, she's a survivor of the occupation, she was in the resistance, and to think her will to live was being broken by my attempts to speak French, the language of, you know, Flaubert and so on. Okay, so, and also don't pay attention to my overheads. They're really, except for the images, they're generally just there to remind me what to say. Okay, so the choice at our stage is, you know, demystify and have people understand what we're saying and realize that it's obvious, wrong, stupid, or boring, or all four. And the alternative is to present things as a brilliantly intricate haze of ever-shifting ever-eddying mirages with evocative, provocative, and not quite graspable shapes moving beyond dimly glowing tapestry embroidered with proto-Elamite script, which has not yet been decrypted. Okay, so while 2 is much higher payoff, we're getting old and tired and we're tenured, so I'm going to do the demystification. Okay. So reality, as it's increasingly revealed to us by the advance of science, is incredibly strange with quantum mechanics and the absurdities of cosmology. And it's really a strange way of looking at our history to include the deep time dimension, right? And evolution and genetics and the evolved computational nature of mind or cybernetic nature of mind is extremely unexpected. The world is unexpectedly different, immensely larger, immensely smaller, immensely slower, immensely faster, immensely more ancient, having more levels, and just fundamentally stranger, right? So the point is that the key elements of scientific reality flagrantly and repeatedly violate our familiar concepts, and which sort of, in the flight of, it's not entirely true, a lot of science studies and so on, but a lot of science is the direct opposite of, working out cultural agendas. It's dispossessing yourself of things which are even before culture, which are deeper than culture, which are very hard, deeply entrenched ways we have of thinking. So we have to repress all that to get to what is true. So I talked a bit about the cybernetic here and how a cybernetic form of information theory is in emphasis and some of its foundational concepts somewhat different than normal information theory. But anyway, with that and the rise of modern evolutionary biology and trying to fit them together, there's sort of been emerging over the last half century a new paradigm, if you want to use that word. The shift is not limited to a specific part of psychology or cognitive neuroscience or the behavioral sciences, but it really concerns how all the most, at the larger scale, how all the major pieces fit together, and then have ramifications down into each of these fields, right? And how everything fits together into a single kind of causal tapestry, which is, and I'm going to be provocative or imperialistic or something like that. I'm going to call this worldview non-optional to reasonable people, right? It's, you can not think about it, but if you think about it, it's really hard to see alternatives, okay? So, in the beginning, Norbert Wiener said there were initial conditions. No, there were initial conditions along with self-executing physics. And together these, produce the unfolding cause and effect history of the universe, right? And so there's all this stuff, which I won't go through, but where one thing leads to the other. And I just want to mention, because I'm going to use it later, that the formation of the Earth from gravitational forces, you end up with the heavier elements sinking to the center, non-accidentally, and lighter elements in the mantle, and still lighter elements in the crust, and still lighter elements as water. And then the lightest elements of all are the gas, and all this stratifies out in the formation of the Earth. So anyway, but all this stuff is step by step, and physics, okay? And a major feature of physics is that entropy, disorder, I'm going to use those equivalently, although in certain discourses they're somewhat different. But anyway, I'm going to, when I say entropy, I really mean the decrease in order by things moving. They move from less probable states to more probable states by chance, and that just is, the time will move things on average statistically in that direction. So order will move into less order, into even less order. And that applies to a number of different kinds of things, but most famously and originally with energy dispersal and thermodynamics. But the underlying point is that whatever kind of order you want to think about, the universe is full of dimensions of degrees of freedom. So random walks roll downhill, right? And so the coming into existence of order in the first place is low probability. And any existing order should over time break down, right? And then I want to, without defining too much what I mean by desirable at the moment, I want to say that desirable states, the more desirable the state, the increasingly unlikely it is to achieve or arrive at or to start out at, okay? It's just, and the more, so if you like maximum energy dispersal, right, and that's what you desirable, then things will flow in that direction, right? But in general, what organisms and other kinds of systems, again, I'm just being very intuitive here, defined as desirable, they're really an incredibly small subset that's not going to be arrived at by chance, right? Very often. Not more often than chance would predict is the right way to put that. So if you walk in the space of proteins, you're extremely out there in astronomical state space before you have a transparent protein matrix for like the lens, and or the pigment in the retina, or features. Anyway, all these things are extremely unlikely. Okay, now. One of my favorite experiments in the history of time. I'm sorry, when do I talk to? Am I already done with my time? 3 p.m.? Yeah. 3. Okay. Okay. I say okay, but we'll see. Okay. My favorite experiment, one of my favorite experiments is Van Helmon's, taking a tree and planting it in soil and, watering it from time to time, and it grows, and then he measured the tree before it went in and the tree after it went in, the weight of the dirt, and the tree came from nowhere, right? There was just dirt there, the same amount of dirt as there was before, right? And so where did that come from, right? And that is, we are organized, and we're like the tree. That the difference between the tree and the air around it, and the difference between the tree or air around us and us, is organization. It's order, okay? And it's not so much a different material, and that you could say it's water that you watered the thing in, but there's water vapor in the air, and anyway. But yes, it's extremely unorganized things being turned into highly organized things, okay? And so this is the starting point, is that, where did this order come from? And if you answer that our field is more logically derivable and deductively principled than many people realize. It's a theoretical framework that's grounded on and non-optionally extends out of basic physics. And so Schrödinger wrote a whole book very early, which was important in the discovery of DNA, leading to the discovery of DNA, which is called What is Life? And I was quite curious about this. I read this in high school, and one of our family friends was had been a colleague of Schrödinger, Max Delbruck, and we talked about this long, but it was a big mystery, right? So how is it that, Schrödinger calculated that, any living body, any human would, if it weren't for some amazing series of anti-entropic defensive systems, that bodies would fall apart in less than a second by basic chemical features. Anyway, so Lida and I argued that the second law of thermodynamics, and here thermodynamics is in square quotes because it's really a larger theory of physical order, and thermodynamics is just entropy and order as applied to energy dispersal and energy concentration. So it's not limited to thermodynamics, but anyway. The second law of thermodynamics is the first law of the life sciences, the brain sciences, and the behavioral sciences, right? And that's Schrödinger's book. And we end up, and nobody really knows, but the estimates are between 30 trillion and 100 trillion cells, and not just a big sack of soup of cells, but highly internally organized cells. So it's estimated that there are 2 million parts for a functional mammalian eye, which is a lot. Okay, and this is stupendously unlikely to have occurred randomly, right? And so we all know that, but we need a physical process that is generating these incredibly high levels of order in the face of the general physical interactions which tend towards disorder, okay? And our order, you know, I just use the word human nature, which people say is many things, or species typical design, or functional design, but it's the thing which replicates from generation to generation, which allows us to operate in an extremely unlikely, highly functional way, right? So we don't walk into the wall, we go out through the door, we can form a fairly good representation of physical objects in the room, we can recognize objects, which is a very hard problem for artificial intelligence. And we know, in fact, all of these sort of competencies are extremely difficult because it takes teams of, you know, thousands over decades to start to approach human-level competences. And okay, so where did all this order come from? And it's not just us, but it's all these creatures on Earth. And so something is pushing back, right? And I know you're in suspense. Okay, so in the history of the universe, a key shift to be Chardonian or whatever would be the transition from physical events causing other physical events causing other physical events to physical events causing a physical event, which is a system which has the capacity to precipitate or cause or bring about another system which has the property of being closely enough like the parent system to be able to itself then replicate again. And so you have the first origination of a chain of, unbroken chain of replicators, because there might have been others which went extinct. But okay, so in the history of the Earth, that happened, you know, 3.5, 4 billion years ago. That was a momentous change, because why is it that this is so different, right? Okay. Okay. And one wants to draw, you know, pictures of a planet with replicators and a planet without replicators. They look really different, right? Okay. And so I'm going to do a slight discontinuity. So non-optional features of this larger paradigm is physics. Everybody should adopt set theory, not too controversial. You can sort of think of it as a dynamic set theory. You have populations, and members cease to exist, and new members enter as a function of what members were previously there. So a set theory, but dynamic set theory that you can generate. But it's non-optional, right? And the existence of replicators, and we know the organisms replicate, that yields a kind of feedback on the relative frequency of variant designs because of the systematic consequences of the design's repeated interactions with the recurrent properties of the world. And I'll have to unpack that a little bit, but that's evolution by natural selection. So it's non-random movement towards more improbably non-randomly good functional designs over time, which is what we're looking for. Right? So this is the only explanation, aside from artificial action, human intentional action, or organisms' action from their regulatory, their cybernetic systems. It's the only natural movement uphill is natural selection. And I don't want to get diverted by talking about spontaneous self-organization, but that's, even though people think it's something similar, it's really not. Okay. So the answer is evolution by natural selection. And so you have replication is this never-ending escalator that brings those design features that enhance functional capacity of the system to replicate itself, to increase in frequency over and over and over above. And there's some qualifications one has to put on that, but that it is the kind of thing that we can observe. It's the kind of thing that explains, right? And so a feature of this is the common feature of this, not an invariable, is that these features become universal in the set of mutually sexually reproducing members of a population or species, right? So species typical is the common, and I think there's various reasons you can show, but I won't have time to, why almost all this stuff converges on universality in species, right? And also, energy dispersal is increasing. Thermodynamic entropy is always increasing, right? But here you have organisms use energy dispersal, like water and through a mill, to drive the formation of new offspring. So they're spreading this highly ordered kind of thing in the world. And so the amount of order in the world is increasing, the amount of replicative order, right? So we're gonna, and the order is not just inside the organism, the order because it is designed for operating in the species task environment. It's a set of relations between the properties of the organism and the recurrent, the enduring properties of the world, right? And of course, selection will happen with a transient property in the world, but it won't be consistent, and so it won't accumulate anywhere. So our designs are properties of deep selection operating in deep time. And also it's not whether the world is, so we'll talk about this in a moment, but Galileo's key concept of a frame of reference, that things are not either variable or uniform as a matter of objective reality, right? Because it's a matter of how you categorize things, whether they're the same or different, right? And so the features which get selected by organisms are going to be ones which turn interactions with the environment, make them pick out features of the environment that describe the environment or interact with the environment such that the environment is seen as or is experienced as more stable, right? So even though, so for example, people raised in high altitude, their lungs are bigger than people raised in lowlands near the oceans. And there's perhaps some genetic difference, quantitative genetic difference behind that. But also if you just bring an infant up there and they're raised in the high altitude environment, their lungs are bigger than their parents are. So the way that the developmental system has evolved to interact with the environment is not to see the pressure of the atmosphere as something that changes. It's the way in which it determines growth is to, and it's not known for sure, but something like how long does it take to recharge my bloodstream to the level of oxygen that it should have, right? And so it grows lungs until that relationship is brought into existence. So that's a system that turns something which, if you're a naive realist, you would say that's different. High altitude, low altitude pressure, those are different, right? From the point of view of the adaptation, it's the same problem, right? And it has the same solution, right? Grow until criterion X, right? So that's what I mean when I say that the whole system of evolution is designed to modify us so that we experience the world as more stable. Changes to the world are, okay, yeah, so here we go. So order is relative to a frame of reference, okay? And then I talked about physics has to have standards of order which are objective or invariant with respect to physical law, right? Because it's not there scratching its head and saying, what am I going to do? Which order pleases me today, right? It self-executes. And so with energy dispersal, you have very clear predictions about what's going to happen if that's your standard of order, right? But then we look at a dust cloud in an early solar system, and we look at the planet Earth later on, and we say the planet Earth is much more organized than the dust cloud, right? Because we have, so if you take association of chemicals by type or by density as a standard, then the Earth is more organized than the dust cloud, right? But that can't be physically relevant exactly because it can't be, entropy can't go in two different directions by two different frames of reference, right? So the energy dispersal is the dominant frame of reference there, okay? And Galileo's innovation of the idea of frames of reference is really key here because it applies profoundly throughout cognitive science about what is order in this representational format and what is order in that representational format, and how does this capture something about this aspect of the world versus that aspect of the world. So you can have as many definitions of order as you like when a system of frame of reference specifies what you mean by order or how it's relative. We want to argue that there is an objective kind of physical order, which is not energy dispersal, but which is replicative order. And the replicative order is the kind of order which increases or produces replication in the physical universe with self-executing laws, right? And replicative order will be anchored by or relative to or defined by each reproducing lineage separately. So replicative order for a fruit fly will be different than replicative order for, you know, a gray whale. And but I want to argue that that's a real thing. It's a real fact of physics that there's such a thing as replicative order, and that solves a lot of kinds of problems, including the increase. So replicative order can increase in the universe, even while overall other kinds of order are decreasing, right? It's not that each life form entropy disorder takes over and kills it sooner or later, but you can have the seeding of new self-organizing systems, things designed to interact with the world such that they increase their order for replication and live out, and then entropy sooner or later takes them as the Grim Reaper. Okay, so with this you can divide organisms into, you can have a frame of reference to recognize in them the highly ordered features which are responsible for the existence of the lineage and for governing its transactions with the stable feature of the world that has made that type of organism as successful as it is, and species can go extinct. It happens all the time, so it's not a foregone conclusion. But whenever we're not extinct, that's a major mystery, I mean, from the first order physics. Okay, and also, so there's byproducts, things which are not there to be functional, but just are there as carried along, like, you know, nipples on a male or something, which is just a byproduct of developmental patterns. And then there's, or, you know, bones being white. They weren't selected to be white, they were selected to use calcium, and calcium happens to be white. And then there's noise, and there's genetic noise because entropy never sleeps, and it's raining down new random variations into our genotype, into our genes all the time. And if you have a highly ordered system, random changes introduced to them are most highly likely to be harmful, to interfere with replicative order. And then, and also, so selection, so there's a balance, there's a struggle between selection on the one hand and entropy, and we're all compromises. So if some people had genetic purification as some sort of ideological goal, they would have to extinguish our species because everybody has a large number of genetic defects. And anyway, all organisms are intermediates between selection and the flow of disorder. And also, there's another kind of, so genetic changes are mutations, but environmental, so the organism depends on certain enduring features of the world, and those a feature changes. That's an environmental mutation, and that also disrupts development. And so we're under assault from genetic and environmental perturbations. So functional architecture is a consequence of selection which tunes the interaction between stable features of the world, adaptive problems, and the designs arising from favored genes. So why, if everybody has a different set of genes, why can we talk about the human genome? We can talk about the human genome because the set of genes in the past that have been interacting with each other for a longer period of time have tuned themselves to the presence dependent on each other's presence of environmental features, right? And those which are novel or new or relatively new or thrown together in an unusual combination, that can create disruptions. And so again, we're all messes, okay? Me in particular. Okay. So also I want to emphasize there's no such thing as genetic determinism, right? Because all architectures are the result of the interaction between their genes and their entire environment of ontogeny, right? So all organisms, there's no genetic fate. Environmental interventions we have no idea what outcomes that can lead to, but there's no reason to think that because you had genes which ancestrally led to most commonly outcome X, that's unchangeable in any way. Drinking Coca-Cola might give you 3 heads. You know, I mean, we know that's not true, but any novel thing that hasn't been tuned by selection is a possible intervention for changing things, right? So organisms are co-determined by the interaction between genes and environment, and we get the order from the genes which have been tuned for a long time with environmental regularities which have been there for a long time, and we get variability and non-functionality from the changes which are outside of the range which the system evolved to respond to. So everything is a mesh between genes and environment, or a lack of mesh, and you get these things which are quite intuitively surprising, like environmental regularities which can trigger dramatic differences along different paths. So among the species of fish called Lorasi, that you're female, you start out female, and then everybody's a female until the single male in your reef area dies, and then the largest female turns into a male, right? And so, okay. So each species has, we always talk about a genetic inheritance, but of equal importance is we have an environmental inheritance. And what could it possibly mean to say we have an environmental inheritance? Well, genes are inherited by highly tuned replicating systems fighting entropy, right? But environmental inheritance happens because a regularity tends to hang around, right? So if there's been gravity before and there's gravity that's generated, that's something you have environmentally inherited. And that's part of the parallel system of inheritance, which is analogous to genetic inheritance, but different in this way, right? And so people don't really study things so much from this point of view because there's so much which is constant and you don't know it will take a lot of law work or maybe artificial intelligence to sort all this out, but logically and inevitably, it's a co-equal inheritance of environmental regularities along with genes, right? Okay, and then we end up with yay, us, in all this complex structure. And then I just want to say that this is the answer to what you might think of as the Gray's Anatomy mystery, which is, or there's 2 answers to it, of which I'll talk about one. But basically, why is the case that you can have a Gray's Anatomy which you open up and you put your finger down on an illustration and the most minor feature of human anatomy, and you can find that virtually anywhere in the species range, right? So why does it take one, if we're all different, why can we have one book which gives all of our anatomies? It's the same anatomy, right? Why can there be a species typical design, right? And so this whole selection leading to predictability, to the extent that something is different for genetic reasons, that means it encounters other conditions and that it can be less well tuned, right? So if you have the highest level of predictability which tends to select for genetic uniformity. And even things that seem like they're genetically different and people talk about as neutral, right? ABO blood groups and things like that. When you really run population cages, not with humans, but fruit flies, right, on them, and you take, some different set of frequencies, 5 minutes, okay. Remember, there's different frames of reference. Okay. I can't remember what I was saying.
You think it's neutral?
Oh, you think it's neutral, right? Well, in fact, if you do a characterization of all possible genes of that length and you just do random walk there, you'll find that only a very tiny proportion of them lead to a functional phenotype at all, right? So even things that are neutral, it's like saying we took the 100-meter winners in the Olympic Games, and they all came in together within 1/100th of within a 10th of a second or something. And so this is really, so therefore that shows that the competition was neutral. But there's been all sorts of preceding competitions where competitors have been screened out, right? And so it's neutralism it's only after this huge filtering, right? And I mean, there's some more you could say about that. Okay. So then the question is, what is, and this is really going to be the beginning of my talk, what is the architecture? So the cybernetic architecture, the regulation, the regulatory system, which emerges naturally in replicating systems because better replication leads to better regulation leads to better replication, right? So that's why these things exist. And okay, and then historically we have this intuitive notion that you're not aware of being born and having a bunch of knowledge in your head, and so it's buried in implicit in various forms, and so that people, Aristotelian position, there's nothing in the intellect which is not previously in the senses. Mind is a blank slate written on the hand of experience, and Darwin, the first person to, you can argue whether he was the first person to ever think most abstractly of the idea of natural selection, but he was the first person who thought with remarkable depth and systematicity about what it all meant. And so he's talking about the Meno dialogue. Plato says that our innate ideas arise from the pre-existence of our soul, right? And they're not derivable from experience. So he's looking, okay, a nativist view, right? And here Darwin says in his notebooks before he's written Origin of Species, read monkeys for pre-existence. There's a second pathway by which knowledge, and we'll talk next time about what we really mean by knowledge, but knowledge enters the mind. And that's that mutations that predispose you to frame things and have data formats and ways of interpreting the world in creating a brain that develops that way. And if that is better for regulating transactions with the world, cybernetically better, then that you have content in your head now, and that didn't come in through the senses. That content came in through natural selection. And in fact, that content, from a Kantian point of view, that's the kind of, he said, space-time and causality, but we would put 100,000 other things on the list, right? And that our experience is organized by the data structures and procedures that are reliably developed as part of our species design, right? And I just want to say here, so I'll close with this. You're supposed to wipe your brow. Okay. So Kant said space-time causality, you need that to organize your experience. Yerkes was an American primatologist in the 20s and 30s, and he had a chimpanzee colony, and he raised chimpanzees from birth. And I can't remember how it accidentally happened, but there was a snake exposed to a chimpanzee who'd never seen a snake before. And the snake expressed all sorts of fear. And so here, the chimp did, I'm sorry, yes. Who knows we don't care what the snake felt, right? Because we, like the chimpanzee, don't like the snake. So there's prejudice for you. Okay, so there you have, so right there, Yerkes added 33% to our knowledge of innate ideas, right? And so now we have 4 things, you know, space, time, causality, and snakes, okay? And I have another 2-minute story which I can skip or I can elaborate. It's, okay, okay, I guess I will steamroller on decency here. Okay, so follow-up work. So other primatologists noticed that rhesus didn't seem, lab-reared rhesus did not seem to express an initial fear of snakes. And so that was puzzling, right? But chimpanzees do, and chimpanzees are higher, right? And lower down rhesus, you know, not as low as snakes, but weren't, okay? But then she did a very interesting set of experiments, okay? So she showed a rhesus model seemingly express fear at a snake, and then the rhesus, initially not afraid of snakes, developed a fear of snakes, right? And so you go, well, social learning. This is just what we need. It's a complete domain general kind of principle, and we knew it all along, and that's what humans do. And humans have erased all their instincts, and instead we have this sort of social transmission process, okay? But then she did something very unusual, okay? She then did the same experiment, but had the apparent rhesus fear reaction to both a bunny and the other rhesus did not become afraid of bunnies, right? So there's something about the snake versus the bunny, which is already in the head of the rhesus, right? And also you did, I think, flowers, and the rhesus did not become afraid of flowers, right? So what that means is you have a mechanism in the head which is already prepared to ontologically categorize objects in the world, right? And that snakes are more inviting of fear reactions than bunnies or other things are, although our dog was afraid of bunnies anyway. But the point here is that, in fact, it's a quite complicated system, because fear, you say fear, oh, well, that's natural, okay, but that means there's a gradient in the head with space that makes trade-offs about how close or far away or what to do compared to other competing goals. And it's actually would take quite a little program to, A, just have fear at all to a certain category of stimuli, but B, to calibrate that up or down. And you might expect in various areas there are more and less venomous snakes. So in the long run, an average of the risk of being exposed to a snake is the other members of your group will be, particularly if you've never seen something before, they'll be a better guide to calibrating what your system will be. But the system already has content in it, okay? And not a fully sensational 3D animated snake in your head, right? Obviously, so this is going to be very important, because what people have real trouble with is the idea that there's pre-existing content in the head. But this content is a very strange kind of content. It's abstract content, right? And so there's something about the psychophysical front end which recognizes snake-likeness, right, and segregates it out from other things. But it doesn't have to be very sophisticated to do a pretty good job, right? And so clinically, it's found that, you know, children who somebody slammed a car door on their hand and there was a green garden hose at their feet, then they become pathologically afraid of snakes, right? And so it includes garden hoses and snakes in the same underlying system. So already, even with this social learning system, you have a lot of abstract content. So there's something, and we are not very far along on characterizing in any of the evolved systems that we have evidence for what a full description, not that or that neuroscientists have very good description of how information of any kind is encoded. And so, great. So finish the sentence. But it's going to be a long process, but we're going to get better descriptions of these things. but they're not going to be like the things in the world, right? They're going to be extremely schematic, abstract, but still contentful, right? Okay, so thank you all, and I'm here to answer questions until midnight.
Professor Tooby. So we have time for 3 questions, I think, and maybe one from the streaming session, because we are streamed.
The last. Okay. Okay. Can I ask if culture is determined by the evolved state of our mind, and if so, are only certain cultures allowed, if you like, and also how would you define culture?
Okay, there's a lot to be said about those questions. The first thing to say is that people think of the claim that there is evolved structure to the mind as a claim about constraints, right? And which is really that in the absence of constraints, you'd be free to do all this other stuff, right? But in reality, mechanisms in organisms enable them to do things, okay? So that with, language as based on an instinct to acquire an art, we are incredibly more contingent and flexible because we have that evolved structure, right? And not, so yes, it might mean that there would be kinds of grammars we couldn't acquire, perhaps, I don't know. But I mean, I think there are experiments on this, but anyway, I would easily believe that to be true. And it would seem almost logically inevitable. But still, you get this huge payoff of flexibility, and so I think there's not a unitary thing called culture. That I think that there are some psychological mechanisms with lots of open parameters, right? And then that creates a big n-dimensional space of possibilities, and then they're explored, and the transactions with the world and the feedback from the world, have their effects. And so I don't think it's something like that's a common source of resistance to an evolutionary approach, where we might be, a century further ahead if the widespread belief did not exist that the claim that there is an evolved structure of the mind means that we are condemned to do every terrible thing that we have always done. And that I think the more you understand these things, the more you can, it's a combinatorics, right? You can put things together in a remarkable diversity of ways, but still the pieces have been given by evolution.
Okay. There is one question from the...
Yeah, I have 2 questions, and I'll ask them both because I think they're related. One is from Luke Smith. Hi, John, what's your take on the replication crisis, on the scarce but improving states of cross-cultural research in psychology, and on the so-called WEIRD problem in social science? So the fact that many results come from Western educated, industrial, rich and democratic society. And a related question from Jamie Kramps is, what do you see as the next major challenge for evolutionary social science?
Okay. Those are easy. No. Okay. I'm sorry, what was the first one? It was...
the replication crisis.
Replication crisis. Okay, so the older I get, the more depressive I get. And so I now think we see the world in terms of what how we label ourselves and how we label the functions of our institutions. But a much more illuminating and depressing way of looking at it is what's the incentives on people, and that things are going to look more like what the incentives predict than, because the really depressive notion is that everybody is impression managing, so what we see is the best possible case. It must be worse than that, right? And so it's easy to, I think it's easy to create results which are not true. And John Iannides' work, I'm a huge admirer of it. Most scientific results are false. And also there's, especially in the pre-paradigmatic stage where you don't really know how to think about something, right? So people develop a kind of intuitive category and then they fool around with it. And so I'm not saying that we're better of anything. I mean, so in some sense it was a gift to us that people were so adverse, because that meant we had to replicate and replicate and replicate again. And so it could be that we're completely wrong in our interpretations, but we're pretty confident about the, but even any science, it's, you have a result, and that result is something that happened in a local space and time under a set of conditions that are with, you don't have a total list of what those conditions were, and you don't know what are the ones that are critical. So how do you generalize from, you know, this injection being good when you're in a different country with a different pathology risk and whatever? I'm sorry, that's enough on that. And I think I've already spoken too long about this, but so the weird question is a complicated one. It's completely true that evolutionary claims are, in general, species typical claims. And it's a test of species typicality. I would say here's a non-false, if you want to be critical of us, a non-falsifiable assumption is that almost everything is at the fundamental structural, complex, adaptive nature. And we have an argument about why that would be true, several arguments. But that if something doesn't replicate in another culture, then you have the burden of explaining why here and not there and how the pattern occurred here. Right? It's not that that's not true, we can do something else. It's a test for have you reached the level of characterization which strikes at human universality yet or not. And that's why cross-cultural testing is really important. And from as early as we could, it's expensive, it's difficult, but we had our a field site that we sponsored where we tried to replicate many things. And then the weird thing, I think I have specific substantive disagreements there about some things, but that the overall impetus to do that is completely praiseworthy, right?
The next big challenge for evolutionary social sciences was Jamie's question.
Okay. I don't know, I can't speak objectively about what the next big thing is or will be or ought to be. Things that interest me are, I think that for the organism to respond, it has to represent the situation it's in terms of evolved descriptions of the world, right? You never interpret something as novel. You might not have seen it before, but the brain tries to put it into categories that it has adaptations to deal with, right? And so we're always situation representing. And also these situation representations, so it's easy if, you know, somebody screams at me, my mind says, I'm in some sort of, my adaptations parse that as some kind of agonistic anger interaction, and I have intuitions and organized structures to deal with that or to run out of the room more likely. But anyway, so situation, what is the repertoire, if that's the right way of thinking about it, of basic situation representations? So I think that our modern societies were designed to think in terms of small scale, and I think we don't appreciate the scale of the problem. So Stalin's statement that, you know, single death is a tragedy, and 1 million deaths are a statistic, right? So we don't feel 1 million times as bad, right? And so, like with COVID, so we have this underlying situation representation, and it was never the case that the situation stood in for millions of others. It was always you were in a local world where the effect of your behavior on beyond, you know, the circle of 200 people was, you weren't selected to pay any attention to that. It never had any effect on those people. It wasn't a thing. So your response is entirely as if everything were micro scale, right? So with the COVID thing, we have governments that say, I can imagine that somebody would die if you walk outside for 30 seconds without your mask. And because I can represent that as a situation, and the cost of the mask is nothing, and the cost of the death is everything, and then we must put infinite weight on increasingly infinitesimal risks because of the way our mind situation represents, right? And I think a whole level of formulating patterns about how, I don't know if that's not to politicize there, but anyway, that if you formalize a set of situation representations and also notice that there's no way for that situation to represent magnitudes, right? So that's why a single death and a million deaths are the same, right? And so, okay, I think I've probably gone too long. Okay, I haven't outraged people enough. Okay, no one has any questions.
I know if you want to come on the floor, as we have it's kind of a ceremonial now. So our two laureates. So thank you again, Professor Tooby. Thank you, Professor Cosmides, also for your presence here. We have here some representatives of our tutelle. So Alexandre Geffen of CNRS and Christophe of École normale. We received the greetings from the Fondation Meyer, Vincent Meyer and Jacqueline Castro. I would like to address a special thanks to all the tutelle, also the HSS, which I'm representing actually. I would like to thank our parent institutions, the member of the Comité Jean Nicod, the secretary of the prize, Frédéric Devignemont, and some people who made all this possible, so the technicians in the room, Clémentine Fourier, Nathalie Evin, Marie Lotz. We reconvene at 2 p.m. on Monday, September 20th, in Salle Jean Jaurès, which is on the 29th, not here. Professor Lida Cosmides will lecture on adaptationism and rationality. And I would like to invite you to join us for refreshments in the Cours Pasteur, which is next door. So thank you again for being here, and congratulations to your laureates. Thank you.
The elbow.
Sign of the time.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much.
I have your.
Okay.